I hope you're enjoying these first few weeks of art history too. Most of you have introduced yourself to me, so thank you. I'll tell you tidbits about myself each week so that we get to know one another. I'm sure that you can see that I love animals, so there's your silly tidbit for the week. I'm holding a Chihuahua there at a Pittsburgh hotel where we were staying to go see the Andy Warhol Museum. Pittsburgh also has a museum of art that is a great place for you to go and see things that you can't see anywhere else but Europe. So I'll keep that rolling in terms of ideas for museums for you for your research project. A few things we should talk about this week. In order to learn most from this class, you need to check the posted answers to the questions each week. The multiple choice assignments are brand new for me this year, and so you're going to find some wonkiness in terms of what I'm telling you in the PowerPoint versus the multiple choice document, meaning that I had a couple of students ask me if you were supposed to answer the questions in the PowerPoint. If there's a question in the PowerPoint, it is a rhetorical question. You only have to do the quiz at the end of each week, and you have to do it Sunday by midnight. That's going to be that way every single week. I have not decided how I'm going to post the answers yet, but the answers that I will post will be under a tab that says posted answers, and they will have explanations as to why the particular answer is correct. I just want to highlight that you're not allowed to Google the answers that you're not allowed to Google the answers for the homework. I want to hear what you have to say, not what Google says. And most of the questions that I'm asking you are critical thinking questions. So I want you to think through the critical thinking question in order to answer the question. Now, does that mean that your critical thinking skills don't need to be used in the multiple choice because it's multiple choice? Absolutely not. Many times you will find that the multiple choice questions are based on you truly thinking about the question I'm asking you. So at some point you'll be asked to write an essay, and I will be giving you feedback for that essay. In order to look at the essay, feedback that I give you, you'll want to cut and paste this link into your browser just in case you don't know how to look at those explanations. I do want your viewpoint, but you have to support your viewpoint with specific visual details from the work of art, or it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo. We do this all the time in English, but it's not something that you're used to doing in terms of art, and I will pick those things out for you and tell you, hey, give more support here by describing what you're seeing. So one more thing, when you see a bullhorn like this one, you need to click on it so that you can hear my voice. I'm trying to... So let's talk about the Renaissance in Northern Europe. This is a map of 15th century Northern Europe, and it shows the power balance that was achieved during the Northern Renaissance. You can see that Flanders is in sort of an isolated area. It encompasses Holland, Luxembourg, and Brabant, and Artois. And then there's quite a few miles between the next kingdom that we look at, which is Burgundy. Burgundy is in modern day France. It is in modern day Eastern France. What happened was that there was a lot of intermarriage between the power of Flanders and the power of Burgundy. And so due to that intermarriage, they ended up with a group of people together that ruled Burgundy at this time, or Northern Europe at this time. Those four people were called the Dukes of Burgundy. There were four of them: John the Fearless, Charles the Bold, Philip the Bold, and Philip the Good. They were commissioners of art, And so we look at them, we look at their patronage and look at how they were responsible for the art in the art world. So the Dukes and Duchess of Burgundy, well, actually, the Duchy, really challenged the power in France. There were assassinations, intermarriages, illegitimate children, treachery, backhanded dealings. It all played into the story of the power of Burgundy. There were key moments in this area's history, like the burning of Joan of Arc. The dynasty was really wealthy and it had a positive and dependent relationship on Flanders. Each of the dukes that you saw on the previous slide married well, and that intermarriage helped the countries become powerhouses. They had art that they commissioned, and one of the pieces of art that they commissioned was a work of art for a Carthusian monastery in Champol, which is what you're seeing an aerial view of now. The monastery was a place of quiet solitude for monks, and it would have been a place that the dukes had vested interest in because it had such a vast amount of land, but also because the monasteries were places of high education. The monks were the only people, or not the only, but the majority of the people within early Northern European Renaissance time that knew how to read and write. And so the dukes would have had a vested interest in funding things within the monastery, in commissioning art for the monastery, because they were epicenters of education. This is the Well of Moses. It is one of the works of art that was commissioned by Philip. Sorry, there are so many of them. I just want to be sure that I tell you the right name. I think it was Philip the Good. Anyway, like I said, this is the Well of Moses. In antiquity, the Well of Moses was painted, so we say it was polychromed. And the sculpture was hyper-realistic. So realistic that Moses even wore a pair of glasses. Here's that humanism coming into play. Obviously, only humans would wear glasses, not divine figures. Therefore, glasses equals humanism. Moses, you know how you pick out Moses? He's the guy with the horns at the top of his head. The horns come from a mistranslation in the King James Bible that seems to have stuck with poor Moses for all of eternity. Michelangelo sculpts Moses with horns as well. So if you happen to go someplace and see religious figures in a painting and there's one with horns, it's not necessarily Satan, it's most likely Moses. Anyway, Claus Sluter's depiction of Moses included horns, and he takes time and care to make the work of art very detailed. So detailed that you can see the notches in the belt that Moses wears. You can also see the leftover polychroming or the leftover pigment from the polychroming. The blue color on Moses's robe is probably the most notable of those polychroming colors. The well never worked. It didn't work because it was a Carthusian monastery, and in order to make it quiet, they didn't want the well to disrupt the peace, and so they just never ran water through it. Yeah, here it is. Sluter was the court sculptor for Philip the Bold. So Philip the Bold would have been the patron here. Um, Sluter was from Haarlem, which was in Flanders, way north in Haarlem. So remember, this one's in Burgundy, France. So this is once again that power differential of crossing the two areas to create a power system. There are 5 total statues of prophets. The view that you're looking at right now is a detail of Moses and David. And we know that Sluter observed things in the natural world, and because of that, it made these sculptures a lot more lifelike, a lot more humanistic. So I mentioned 2 vocabulary words, polychroming and hyperrealism. Here are the definitions for polychroming and hyperrealism. Here you can see a diagram of an altarpiece. Your textbook a lot of times will have these illustrations of the architectural schematic of a work of art. Here in this case, it's the altarpiece. There are 2 different types of altarpieces. The one you see here is called a triptych. Well, they label it as a polytych. A polytych is a work of art that has more than 3 movable parts. In this case, it is a triptych. The center stays stationary and the wings to the right and left move in and out. Because there are 3 main panels, we call that a triptych. The other type of polytych that we'll look at is a diptych. It just means that it has 2 movable panels. It opens and closes like a book. As far as the special words for the stand in which the altarpiece is resting on, I'm not really concerned about you knowing the formal terms for the altar. This is milk. So this is the Limburg brothers' calendar pages. The Limburg brothers were 2 brothers from the city of Limburg, and so that's where we get their name from. And they designed calendar pages for a book of hours. A book of hours had small devotionals in it that went along with the Bible that you were supposed to do every day. The devotionals were usually purchased by the rich, remembering that they would have had to have been hand painted because the printing press hadn't been invented yet, so they couldn't mass produce illustration, as well as someone had to sit down and physically hand write a copy of the textbook. This slide shows you all 12 of the calendar pages, but we're going to look up close at the February page. This is the February page. You can see that the workers had been out in the field in the snow. If you've ever been to Northern Europe, especially in Flanders, it's really cold and everything's sort of tree-lined and sort of sparse. It's not as commercialized as places that are closer to cities. And a lot of the rural area seems to go on for miles and miles. Here you see a rural scene in which people are out working in the field. You've got a guy walking behind his donkey. You've got a guy out in the field, looks like chopping wood. They show you the pheasants that are in the front. Pheasant was a common meal that they would have butchered. And then you've got a corral of sheep. There's a lady that sits at the fire. This is the detail on the right side of the slide here. She sits by the fire. She's warming her skin because she's been out working and it's wet and she's cold. We know that she's of upper class because she wears a very bright blue dress. Her headdress is somewhat special. She's upper middle class. She's not aristocracy. If she was aristocracy, she wouldn't be out working at all. But you can see her warming her legs by the fire, but she's wearing a pair of pantaloons. The two gentlemen that stand behind or sit behind her are warming their legs by the fire as well. But if you look really closely, you'll see that they don't wear any undergarments. Undergarments were reserved for the upper class only. You know, the image before may or may not have been a true depiction of the way the upper middle class lived, or the way the lower class lived. And that is because we know that the lower class lived in something called a hovel. According to dictionary.com, a hovel is a conical building that enclosed a kiln. During the feudal life, hovels were common places for the lower class. You can see they have beds that are made of hay with some sort of textile over top of it to use as a blanket. So they literally slept directly on the ground on top of a bale of hay with a textile over top. It also had a small area for a fire or a kiln. Here you see the top taken off of the hovel so you can get a seat inside, but it would have had a roof made of mud and thatching. So textiles during the Northern Renaissance were a really important part of art and patronage from the aristocracy. They built large castles that had draftiness to them, and so they often wanted textiles to sort of warm up their walls. They were kind of nice because you could roll a textile up with you and take it with you if you had a summer home where you would place it in your summer home, made it feel more like home. There were major weaving centers throughout Northern Europe. They were in Flanders, in Bourges, in Brussels, Tournai, and Arras. The textiles provide important information for us so that we understand the research and development of Northern Europe, but we also understand the infrastructure of trade in Northern Europe because we know where the textile houses were located, and we've been able to classify what textile house wove which tapestry. This is one of the more fascinating textiles that we study. It was part of a 7-part series and commissioned by Anne of Brittany in France when she was getting married to one of the French kings. It's housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There is a cloisters. It's in a different building of the Met. And if you happen to go there, you can see 4 of these tapestries. We only have 4 of them left. They're really just a beautiful thing to look at. The vegetable dyes that they used to dye the yarn that created the tapestries were bright in color, but also very expensive to dye. And so because of that, a tapestry that had lots of color and lots of variation was also a status symbol of wealth. The other thing that the tapestries had in them that was really interesting were actual gold and silver woven into the tapestry. Because of the gold and silver threading in the tapestry, a lot of the tapestries were burned during the French Revolution to get the gold and silver out of them. So it's a miracle that we still have the particular tapestries that we have. And this one has a lot of symbolism in it. The garden in which the unicorn has run into is a symbol for Mary's virginity and purity. The legend was the unicorn could only be captured by a virgin, and so he would not have run any other place but to the garden of Mary's virginity. Unicorns were mythological, magical animals, just very much like the way they looked at Jesus and the way they looked at their religion. And so there are Christian symbols within the work of art. You see a group of townspeople gathering around the fountain where the unicorn is. There are also many animals that are symbols in Northern European Renaissance art, or just Northern European culture in general. They have a lot of different symbols that represent sayings that they have in their culture. The stag, the animal that you see that's sitting in front of the unicorn, off to the right with the long antlers, he is a symbol for fertility because his antlers shed and regrow every year. I'll tell you more interesting symbols throughout the works of art, but know that that is a stylistic feature of early Northern Renaissance work. Symbolism within the tapestry carries a religious message. Most Northern Renaissance works are packed full of symbolism. Let's take a look at the symbolism in the unicorn tapestry. The stag is a resurrection symbol because it has to shed and grow new antlers. The antlers on this stag are really big, and so we assume that he's getting ready to shed his antlers and grow a new set. It is also considered a protector against evil and a protector against poisonous snakes. This is the Marode altarpiece. It was a small triptych, and it was made for private use in a chapel. It's currently at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in the cloisters, where the tapestries that Anne of Brittany commissioned for her husband for France is located. The center scene of the triptych is a scene of the Annunciation, and on the left wing of the triptych, you can see the donors' pictures. The donors are the ones that paid for the work of art. They kneel as they're looking into the scene, and they are presented as being privileged enough to see the Annunciation, which would have been a very special place in the theory of the clergy. We think that they were brother and sister. The monk that kneels before you, or before the scene, obviously would not have been married in the Catholic Church, and so the woman behind him, we think, was also dedicated to the Catholic Church as a nun, and that they were brother and sister. In the center panel, you see the angel Gabriel kneeling before Mary, letting her know that she is with child. On the right side of the triptych, you see Joseph. He was Jesus' earthly father and is a carpenter. It's why we think that Jesus was a carpenter, because typically in this time period, your family owned some sort of family business, and you would learn to do whatever the family business was. So that would have been carpentry for Jesus. You can see that Robert Campan uses twisted perspective. Twisted perspective simply means that the some of the scene is looking head on at the scene, like we see Mary's face. It's frontal and looks directly out at the viewer. But then you see the tabletop beside Mary tilted up towards the picture plane so that you can see what is on the tabletop, as well as Joseph's carpenter table is tilted upward so you can see what is on his tabletop. Joseph is making mousetraps. Those mousetraps are an allegory for Satan. In the center panel, you can see several symbols. In the next slide, I have picked those symbols out and labeled them for you. The towel on the back is servitude. The candle on the table that's being snuffed out is God's witness, because God is said to be present through Jesus as a human being. then the candle is snuffed out. That is a result of the humanistic theories that are going on right now. It's hard to see when I show you the detail of the central panel. You'll be able to see it better, but there's a cross that comes in through the window that a little putti has grabbed and is flying towards Mary's head. That is the way that Mary became pregnant without having sex, basically, by being a virgin. Way back in the day, they used to think that you could get pregnant through your ear. And so that's why the angel, or the little putti, is carrying the cross towards Mary's head. If you covered up the angel Gabriel's wings, you would see that Gabriel tends to look very human-like. You would never know that he was not an angel. You would just think he was a human. There's another concept that we've discovered here with the Merode altarpiece, and that is the S curve. The angel Gabriel kneels towards Mary's side, but if you took your finger, you could draw an S over the large shape of the angel Gabriel's body. That S curve is early Northern Renaissance art signature, in that they think the S curve makes the body look more lifelike. We will see that the Italians have a different idea of what makes the body look more lifelike, but for early Northern Renaissance art, that S curve is the way that they imbue life into the figure. Here's the detail of the central panel of the Merode altarpiece. You can see the symbolism even more clearly and up close here. That snuffed out candle that I mentioned in the last slide. You can see above the fireplace there's a candle that's unlit. Mary kneels at a kneeling bench. There is a bright blue pillow next to her red garment. That juxtaposition is an important juxtaposition that helps Mary stand out. If you follow the red all the way around the canvas, you'll see that it leads your eye completely around the picture. I think the S curve is a little bit easier to recognize here in the detail. If you take your finger and start where Angel Gabriel's heel touches the picture plane, move it to the knee, back towards the hip, and up towards the shoulder, you see that S curve that I'm discussing. The symbolism in the left wing is a little bit less overt and obvious. The garden that the patrons kneel in is a symbol for Mary's virginity. There's a guard that stands at the back of the door in which the fortress was built. It's a symbol that the owner's garden respect their faith. We know that the donors were a very important part of commissioning art during this time period. Typically, the donors had their hands in the church, but they also had influence and say in civic things as well. Here's the detail of Joseph as a carpenter. He's making the mouse traps. This is Jan van Eyck. He is one of the most important and influential people that we study in early Northern Renaissance art, and really in Northern Renaissance time period. He makes art that is somewhat unparalleled in the history of art, in that he is such a good artist at capturing detail. I'll show you that detail. Originally, we credited Van Eyck with the invention of oil paints, but we know that Robert Campin had oil paints to paint the Merode altar scene, and so because of that, we say that he popularized oil paints. He was the court painter for Philip the Good. And here you see the Van Eyck wedding portrait. Here's the detail of the slide, or of the painting that I promised you. You can see the dog in the front. His name is Fido. He stands for fidelity. It's where the term Fido came from. You can see the shoes in the lower left-hand corner. Those shoes are shoes that symbolize the man goes out into the world and makes his own way. I have a close-up of those shoes. I think you'll be quite impressed. You see the oranges on the windowsill. They are ripe. The point there, the symbolism is that it is the perfect time to get married. You see above Giovanni Arnolfini's head a chandelier with one candle lit. That is the presence of God. In the back, you see a broom that hangs on the bedpost. That broom is a symbol of the wife's duties. Giovanni Arnolfini holds his hand up in a blessing gesture to say that he is giving his blessing for his wife to do business in his absence. This slide is a detail of the mirror that you saw in the back of the room. The mirror is only about the size of a quarter. This painting is very small. It's about the size of the average sheet of notebook paper. In the center of the mirror, you see reflected Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride tying the knot. You see them from the back. You see a clergyman, and you see Van Eyck himself. Any legal document had to have a witness, and therefore the two people that were required to make the marriage legal were the priest and a witness, and Van Eyck is the witness. Furthermore, he signs the painting to say that Van Eyck was here. It's signed in Latin. He's sort of playing with his intelligence here. He's sort of like messing with the viewer, trying to be witty, and he dates it. So it says 1438, I believe. That would have been a sign that he was present when the two were married. The beads must stand for something specific, but I can't tell you what it stands for. They could be prayer beads, but I don't know for sure. I've done research on it, and I can't seem to find any information on where the beads came from. The mirror is framed with small rondelles. The small rondelles are about the size of a dime in the actual painting, and they depict the stations of the cross. This painting is so very detailed and lifelike in its textures, and you're going to see what I mean by that in this next slide. This is a close-up of the shoes that are at Giovanni Arnolfini's feet. You can see how very much they look like wood, and I wish that I could take you to the London Gallery and show you this painting up close because it's breathtaking. The textures are so very real that they feel like you could just reach in and pick up that shoe. You know exactly what that shoe feels like underneath your hand because because Van Eyck has illustrated it so very perfectly. You even get to see the mud that is on the shoe. The mud is representative of the man going out and making his way in the world. Now, at this time in Northern European culture, wooden shoes were popular, as well as the way that Giovanni Arnolfini is dressed with the large top hat and the garment that is made of fur. It's a representation that his family is a fur trader, and the hat was made of fur. We always kind of make fun of that hat and say it looks like he's a pimp. This is a detailed slide up close of the dog. This dog is just amazing. You can really see every single hair that this dog has in the painting in real life. The chandelier, here's a close-up of it as well. You can see the light bouncing off of the metal. You can see the detail that there's only one candle in the chandelier, representing the eye of God. You can even see the hem of the dress that Giovanni's bride wears. Giovanni's bride wears a velvet dress that is fur-lined. In the original at the museum, the fur, it reads very clearly. Here on the PowerPoint, I think that because you're looking at a picture of the painting, it flattens it out a little bit and you can't see that actual touchable detail. But I assure you that in the museum, it is so very lifelike. So just to wrap things up about this particular portrait, Giovanni Arnolfini's family were fur traders, and there are many, many symbols within the work of art. There is a misconception that Giovanni Arnolfini's bride is pregnant at the time that this painting was painted. This is not true. It's just a rumor. She was not pregnant. I know her belly looks swollen because she's picking up the front of the garment and placing it at the top of her belly. Why? I know this sounds silly, but back then, women often wanted to advertise that they were a baby-carrying host. It assured their line in succession to marrying wealthy. She needed to marry wealthy to take care of herself and her family, because it was not safe for women to work at that point in time. If they did work, they only worked in women's professions, and there were not a lot of women's professions out there. Even baby delivering usually happened at home by the people that were closest to the woman, that loved the woman, her sister, her mother, her grandmother, people like that. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you about this painting? Just that it has really great atmospheric perspective. You can easily see the foreground, middle ground, and background in the painting. We do this fun little trick that if you put your thumb up against the chandelier and look at the painting again, you'll see that that chandelier is very much an integral part of the painting. Without it, the painting does not seem to have a middle ground. It only seems to have a foreground and a background. Another work of art that was really quite important that that Van Eyck painted is the Man in Red Turban. The Man in Red Turban is a self-portrait of Van Eyck. And it too is fairly small. It's about the size of a legal pad of paper. Van Eyck has painted himself with this whimsical red turban on the top of his head. Hats were very common back in that day. They were part of Northern European fashion. They, in this point in time, were a status symbol, just like Giovanni Arnolfini's portrait. He had a large hat made of fur on his head. If you've ever been to this area of the world, it is fairly cold and windy. I was there in June and it felt more like October here. You can see Van Eyck's face in such a detailed representation. It's a very honest portrait in that he doesn't really idealize his face. You can see every wrinkle, you can see indentations within his face, you see his prominent cheekbones, and you can tell that he's a little bit older of a gentleman. He's not, in his 20s. The eyes have been an interesting subject of debate within the history of art. Many people who see this portrait or saw this portrait back in Van Eyck's day said that the portrait was bewitched because the eyes seem to follow you no matter where you go within the room. That technique in painting is something that some artists desire to capture. I know that you've all been to some sort of gallery in which you've seen a portrait that seems to follow you with its eyes. Van Eyck pioneered that, as well as he pioneers something called trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil is a French term. It means to fool the eye. And where trompe-l'oeil is present in this particular work is in the frame. This frame looks as if it is an actual picture frame. And I kid you not, when you walk up to the painting, it literally looks three-dimensional. The only way you can tell that it is not three-dimensional is by turning to the side of the painting and seeing that the width of the frame does not project from the canvas. At the top and bottom, we see Van Eyck having signed the portrait. He signs it with a personal motto of his. It is, as I can, not as I would. They are anagrams for his name, and they are done in Greek. This is, again, Van Eyck playing with you intellectually. He's being witty. Some people would say he's being smart alecky. In this piece, we see a parallel of realism to the Italians. There is no one else in the history of art at this point that rivals Van Eyck in terms of being able to capture these details that are so very lifelike. At this point, no one rivals Van Eyck in painting. And what he and the other Northern European painters are doing for painting, the Italians are doing in sculpture. So we're not quite done with Van Eyck yet. This is Van Eyck's The Ghent altarpiece. It's a true masterpiece and a prized polytriptych. It's been fought over for more than 100 years in the history of art. It has a complicated history. It was so very valued that during both world wars, they took it and placed it in a salt mine to keep it safe. It's been stolen 6 times, and it's also been disassembled for storage. When it was stolen, the panels were all broken apart and taken to different places. Miraculously, they've always made their way back to Ghent, which is where the altarpiece is today. It's in the Cathedral of St. Bravo, and it has been restored. On the front of the polytech, you see gracile figures. We talked about those gracile figures in the Proto-Renaissance time. I'm getting ready to show you a close-up of those gracile figures. Here's the close-up of the gracile figures. It's an Annunciation scene where the angel Gabriel descends upon Mary to tell her she's with child. You see the dove above Mary's head. It is the Holy Spirit. That moment in time where Mary is imbued with child. The gracile figures, again, are those figures that are painted in gray and painted intentionally to look like sculpture, only painted in tones of value, no actual color. We know that Van Eyck went to Bruges, and he set his sights on painting the Ghent altarpiece by attaining that commission. It was begun by his older brother Hubert. Hubert dies in the middle of painting it, and so Van Eyck actually finishes it. It's 12 feet tall, and it's one of the largest works of art that is done in the 15th century. It was commissioned by Philip the Good, and so it has a political and social connection to Ghent. and it led to the mayor of Ghent's appointment. So we see that there's a tie between government and church here through this altarpiece. We also see at the top the donors being depicted in the very central part of the in the top central figures. So not the ones on the right and left, the two at the top. In the next slide, you will see the restoration. This was the restoration of the Ghent altarpiece. In the slide prior, you saw it before restoration. Here they've cleaned it, and so the grisaille figures are even more gray in tonal values. They have a lot less yellowish to them. Whenever restoration happens, the restoration usually is a sense of cleaning the portrait or cleaning the work of art. Because these are used in churches, a lot of times the work of art will catch dust, it'll catch oils from the service, and just debris from candles burning. This is the front of the Ghent altarpiece when the altarpiece is closed. The next slide, you'll see the altarpiece open. The altarpiece would have only been opened on Sundays and feast days. This is the interior of the Ghent altarpiece. It has images in it of the sacrifice of the lamb, the original primordial couple for Christianity, Adam and Eve, Jesus having ascended into heaven, seated on the throne with Mary and John at his side. The lower central panel, you see the presentation of the lamb. It is a symbol for Jesus. You see in Jewish culture, every year at Passover, they were to sacrifice their best lamb to God. And so Jesus in the Christian faith is that sacrifice. The lamb represents Jesus's life, and that he was crucified on the cross, just the way the lamb is getting ready to be sacrificed to God on the altar. You see townsfolk gathered around to witness the sacrifice. In the upper register, in that main center panel, you see Jesus sitting at the throne. If you zoom in to see up close the crown that the central figure wears, you see real gemstones being depicted and a breathtakingly fanciful crown. On the left, on Jesus's right, you see Mary, Jesus's earthly mother, and on the left you see John, one of Jesus's disciples who took care of Mary when Jesus was crucified. To the right of John, you see a harpist playing the harp, and then you see Mary. Do you remember when I told you that it was a thing for Northern European women to sort of advertise that they were able to carry babies? Well, here you can see the way they envision that woman up close. She looks as if she has a bun in the oven, even though she doesn't. Her belly is quite swollen, as an advertisement that she's capable of bearing children. You also can see that S-curve feature a little bit better in this work of art because Mary is nude. If you follow her leg up to her hip and then across to her breast and up again to her shoulder, you see that S-curve that we talk about. Adam is on the opposite side. He is nude as well. They both cover up their genitals because they have the knowledge of the forbidden tree of knowledge. Or Mary took the apple ate from the apple, and that gave them knowledge from the forbidden tree of knowledge that told them that they were naked. And so here they stand in the politic with some sense of humility. Well, Van Eyck might have been the best artist in terms of being able to capture very minute, very realistic details. But Roger van der Weyden rivaled Van Eyck. He was an assistant to Robert Campan, who was the painter of the Merode altarpiece. And van der Weyden was able to capture emotion in a way that we haven't been able to see through Van Eyck's work. When Van Eyck receives the commission for the Ghent altarpiece, van der Weyden was assisting in the workshop of Robert Campan. Van der Weyden's fame eventually rivals Van Eyck's. He was renowned for his portrait, just like this portrait that you see here. Northern European women valued a high forehead, and so they often used to pluck the hair at the front of their face so that their hair sort of looked as if their face was longer. You see all the hair piled up at the back of her head. It showcases her beautiful tall forehead, as well as you see this wimple that she wears. These headdresses were common in Northern European Renaissance times. They cover the forehead, and they have such a beautiful see-through quality to them. When you look at this painting, it's quite incredible, the see-through quality that van der Weyden gets in the texture of the wimple. We know that she is of higher status in society because she wears fine fabrics, because she has this highly plucked forehead, and because her skin is very white. All of those things put together are things that equal aristocracy in early Northern European art. She also sits with her hands clasped in front of her body, and she looks downward, not directly out at the viewer or out at van der Weyden, who's painting her portrait. It was considered disrespectful at this time for women to look men in the eye. And so she veers her gaze downward. One of the terms that is associated with this work of art is iconography. Iconography is an important term. It goes with people only. So the difference between symbolism and iconography is iconography goes with people and symbolism goes with things. You can see that the iconography in this work of art would be her high forehead, the wimple, her hands clasped in front of her, the fact that she's looking down. Those are all indications that she is in upper class society. Those things that tell us what a person does or what a person did in society, where their class qualification fell, those are all considered iconography. So I would say the more famous of the works that we study of van der Weyden's is the Deposition. It's that time in which Jesus is being lowered from the cross. You can easily see the S-curve in the body presented here. You can see it in Jesus as well as Mary. It's this curvilinear way in which the body is represented. There's definitely a sense of atmospheric perspective within this work of art. You see that van der Weyden sort of layers people into the work of art the way we saw in the Proto-Renaissance time. However, they have a very more realistic and humanistic look to them. Mary is a person who lived here on earth, and Jesus is depicted as a person who walked the earth just yesterday before he was crucified. We see that in the human-like qualities in the representation of his body. We see that in the emotion that's being portrayed within the work of art. Van der Weyden does an excellent job of carrying the viewer's eye around the canvas. If you follow the placements of red within the canvas, you will see that your eye moves from the right to the left of the canvas, following the red. The red helps to contain the scene. It helps to make the scene feel believable and real, but it also sort of bookends the scene. You see lots of texture. The texture is no less played up in van der Weyden's art than it is Van Eyck's. I'm going to show you a close-up here in a moment of the emotion that is on the faces of the people within the painting. This is a close-up of Mary. Mary was so distraught over seeing her son that she swooned and fainted. The people behind her picked her up. When you look at the people who picked her up, you can see the detail of the fingernails and the hand, but moreover, you can see the emotion in Mary's face. You can actually see the tears that are dropping from her eyes. The texture of the headdress that she wears is quite remarkable. You can even see the very well done texture of the hair. You get an idea of what type of fabric the participants wear. Mary looks as if she's in some sort of cotton-like garment, and that the wimple is a different type of fabric than the fabric that her dress is made out of. You get a sense of the texture of the skin, of the hand of the person that reached down to catch Mary as she fell. Here again, a detail of the emotion on the face of the woman who's holding Mary up. This particular work was commissioned by the Crossbowmen's Guild in Belgium. And so, you know, when you think about crossbowing, you think of that curvilinear way in which the bow retracts and shoots. I believe that it has been represented in the way that van der Weyden places the figures. Their gestures are very curvilinear. Here, if we compare van der Weyden's deposition to Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride's portrait, you can see the lack of emotion that Giovanni Arnolfini communicates. For all sakes, he is representing a marriage. The debate about whether or not he's grieving over his dead wife would have been more apparent if we had seen emotion on Giovanni Arnolfini's face. However, there is none. We only see emotion on the faces in the portrait that van der Weyden does. Really, nobody is able to communicate emotion quite as realistically as van der Weyden does in this moment. This is van der Weyden's St. Luke drawing the Virgin and Child. You can see that van der Weyden gets a good sense of atmospheric perspective by including an open window in which the townspeople are shown looking across the river. St. Luke is drawing Mary while she holds Jesus. Remember, back in that day, they didn't have photography, so of course the only way to preserve history was to draw or paint a portrait, a commemorative portrait of the person at their prime, and sometimes right before they pass, would have been custom in the upper wealthy. So this is Petrus Christus, a goldsmith in his shop. And you can see a reflection of the current political climate in Northern European society based on this painting. I want you to turn to page 592 in your textbook and check out the closer look. It will tell you all about the symbolism within the painting and tell you what it all means. One of the most important things to notice is that the man that stands behind the gold changer, who is dressed in red, is named John, and he is betrothed to the woman standing next to him. He is the regent of Scotland, or he becomes the regent of Scotland. When his sister is born, she has a rightful heir to the throne of Scotland. She is Mary, Queen of Scots. So go to your book and look at the closer look. Christus is an important artist because he records the political agenda in Northern Europe, but he's really a follower of Van Eyck's. As we look at the next few paintings, keep in mind that the heavy hitters here are Van Eyck and van der Weyden and Robert Campin, and then Hugo van der Goes. After those artists, we find that everybody else seems to fall in line with following them. Here's a shot of that closer look, just so you know where it is that you're looking and what you're looking for, in case you have a different edition. If you happen to have a different edition of the textbook, you may or may not be able to find this closer look. If you can't find it, don't worry about it. Just move on in the textbook, or you could zoom into this picture and read some of the information on this picture. Dietrich Bouts is a follower of van der Weyden's. Well, actually, he's a follower of Robert Campin's. You can see how the Marode altarpiece is reflected in the central panel of this work of art. Similar architecture and similar treatment of the human figures. You don't get that heavy S curve, but they're all sitting at the table eating the Last Supper. The Last Supper is going to become a very important subject matter that we're going to explore a lot in Italy. Here's a close-up of the center panel. It's kind of a fuzzy picture. I apologize. It's because I've taken the picture prior and blown it up so you can see the detail. Notice the flooring has those transversals and orthogonals that lead the eye backward and recedes into space. It helps the table read as three-dimensional. Also, the ceiling in the work of art helps the work of art in general read as three-dimensional and receding into space. This one doesn't have a main central point, like one-point perspective, because it hasn't been invented yet, or it is being invented in Italy, but the Northern Europeans have not been exposed to it. But you do get an idea that Jesus is the central focus of the image. If you look at the two people on the back wall that peer their head in, or peer their faces in through the scene, that's that technique where the donor portraits are being allowed to view a holy event. So this is the Portinari altarpiece, and it is one of the most important pieces in the 15th century. It is done by Hugo van der Goes, and here you see a panned out version of the Portinari altarpiece. It's a fairly large altarpiece. It's about 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, so it's life size. It is done by Hugo van der Goes, and you can see that he uses similar treatment and framing as Van Eyck did in the Ghent altarpiece. When the altarpiece is open, it shows the... This work of art is by Hans Memling. It's the Virgin with Saints and Angels. It's the St. John altarpiece, and it went to a hospital in Belgium. I want you to look it up in your textbook and read about it. You can see the Northern European obsession with texture in it. Memling loves pattern, and you can see that behind Mary and on the floor. You see how Memling uses the texture to describe the floor space that helps your eyes recede, or helps the tapestry appear as if it recedes into space. You can see behind Mary the vast landscape that the Northern Europeans seem to want to capture in their altarpieces. Here you can see a close-up of the altarpiece from Bourges. Notice that the texture of the fabric that goes behind Mary's body and the texture on the floor that's underneath Mary's feet is one of the hallmarks of early Northern Renaissance painting. The texture of the fabric. Memling loves pattern, and he uses it just like van der Weyden does to help communicate space. So you know that the work of art has texture that recedes into space. It helps carry your eye and transform that atmospheric perspective. Memling was from Flanders, but he paints in Bourges, and he was a wounded warrior from the war, and he refused to pay his hospital bills off. And so he decides that instead of paying the hospital bills, he's going to sell paintings instead to pay for them. So this particular altarpiece went to a hospital. It is likely it went to pay off one of his hospital bills. This is the diptych of Martin van Nieuwenhove, done by Hans Memling. You can see that Memling poses his subjects in this praying hands position with the book underneath his hands, and you can see that he uses St. Luke's St. Luke drawing the Virgin as inspiration for Mary and the baby. So go back and compare this to van der Weyden's St. Luke drawing the Virgin. So for the next few of these, I want you to read the selection in your textbook about them. You may find that you don't have some of them. That's okay if you bought a different version. Just read the ones that come up in your textbook. You don't have to read so much. So this is Tilman Reibenscheider's The Altarpiece of the Holy Blood, and some of you may not have this in your textbook. It is a piece that I have seen personally. I've been to the area of the Rhine in Germany where this work of art is, and it is quite breathtaking and beautiful, so just really had to tell you about it. Reimenschneider produces a large number of altarpieces, but only two that survive intact. Why don't they survive? Mostly because they were made of wood. Neglect, fire, and iconoclasm are responsible for the disappearance of many of them. This altarpiece marks the spot where there is said to be a relic of Jesus's blood. A relic is a term that you learned in Romanesque art. It is something holy, or that the Christian church views as being holy, in this case, a drop of Jesus's blood. Some of them have bones of saints, other relics have, pieces of fabric, something like that. And relics were common amongst churches in the Romanesque phase because people would travel from church to church to visit the relics because they thought that they had a sense of holy power. These particular type of altarpieces consisted of four main elements. There was a central section or a corpus that houses the figures. Typically, it was only open on holidays and feast days and Sundays. The predella is this box down at the bottom, just like we saw in the altarpieces that were made of paint. It contains sculpture, and it raised the corpus above the altar. It has a tall superstructure with really intricate design. This one has a 30-foot tall superstructure. The interesting thing is that the church that it is in is so very tall that you almost don't notice how tall the 30-foot high superstructure really is. This is a scene the altarpiece depicts the scene of the Last Supper. The central figure in the corpus is Judas. Riemenschneider here creates the exact moment in time where Christ reveals that one of his disciples will betray him during the Last Supper. You see a close-up here of the details of the people or the figures within the corpus. So take a good look at those. Look at how detailed they are. Notice that they're just as detailed as the paintings that we've seen come out of Northern Europe. Here you see a close-up detail of the corpus. It's that central box and the predella, the box at the bottom. This close-up shows you the set of figures that were carved for the corpus, and it uses a set of features that carry throughout the figures. They have large heads, overly emotional faces, elaborate hairstyles and large hands, and a linear design to the clothing. They harken back to the Roman period in which plebeian art was characterized with those large heads and large hands. It carries the message that Christianity is for all people, not just the aristocracy. Here you can see the different types of sections to the altarpiece: the tall superstructure, the central corpus, and the hinged wings on the right and the left. They open and close just like the Portinari altarpiece did, just like Robert Campan's altarpiece did. The one that you have seen closed is the Ghent altarpiece. And it features the predella, which contains sculpture to raise the corpus above the altar. Here I want you to read about how they make woodcuts and engrave on metal. Okay, so last but not least, in this episode, or in this chapter, in this lesson, I want you to understand about Johann Gutenberg. Northern European art really has a defining moment when Van Eyck popularizes oil paints. Even though Van Eyck popularizes oil paints in the Northern European area, Italy doesn't learn about the oil paints until Hugo van der Goes paints in oil paints, and the painting goes to Florence. Well, they have another really big moment when the Johann Gutenberg invents the printing press. He basically takes a wine press, a press that's used to smash grapes, and modifies it. Now, he's not the first to create a printing press. There are lots of people before him who create printing presses. The big deal about Gutenberg's printing press is it has the option of movable type. This option allows individual letters to be arranged and locked together, then inked, and then printed onto paper. It wasn't Johann specifically that invented the press, it was his entire workshop. It came from Maine, Germany, and they printed more than 40 copies of the Gutenberg Bible in 1455. In 1455, they printed the Gutenberg Bible. There are more than 40 copies that still exist today. As early as 1465, excuse me, 2 German printers worked in Italy to continue the printing press's fame and acclaim and technology and development into all of Europe. And by 1470, the press made its way to France, Flanders, Holland, and Spain. With this invention being the fastest way to make a number of identical books, the intellectual and spiritual life of Europe and art in general changes forever. Your textbook states that the Gutenberg's printing press was the first press to put together oil-based inks, cast metal letters, and the press mechanism to publish a text. In light of the Gutenberg printing press, we had a couple of works of art that ended up being very important. This is Martin Schongauer's The Temptation of St. Anthony, and it was done in 1470 to 1480. It's about 12 inches tall by 9 inches wide, so about the size of a sheet of notebook paper, and it is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. According to Schongauer's biographer, there was a rigorous asceticism that was practiced by St. Anthony in the Egyptian desert that allowed him to levitate into the air, where he was attacked by devils trying to beat him back to the ground. The imaginative power with Schongauer interpreted their assault and made this engraving famous throughout Europe. At least 7 copies of the plate survive, one by the master Schongauer. Michelangelo, as a boy, was said to have copied it in color, and Durer reused the figure of the devil with a club above Anthony in one of his greatest engravings, Night, Death, and the Devil. We will learn about both of those paintings in High Renaissance art in Northern Europe and High Renaissance art in Italy. Schongauer's interpretation, though, preserves some sense of plausibility. His grotesque devils are illustrated with mixing body parts from different domains of the animal kingdom. You see birds, insects, fish, a lizard, and a dog. We get wings contributed by insects and fish. There's horns and fur and scales, beaks and claws to make up fiends who actually interact with the human malice. A generation later, their example must have nourished the fantastic inventions of Hieronymus Bosch, who we will learn about in early Baroque art of Northern Europe. So this is the City of Nuremberg from the Nuremberg Chronicle, published by Anton Kohlberger in 1943. It was a woodcut within a printed book, and it had hand-colored illustrations after it was printed. Michael Wilgemonth, with a few others, had a workshop, and Anton Kohlberger publishes this particular illustration. It was done by woodcut, and it represents one of the first high-quality books where the text and the illustrations were on the same page. The invention of the printing press made that possible. It really allowed for visual complexity that opens a new avenue of illustration in print design. The Nuremberg Chronicle in the Nuremberg Chronicle, A History of the World was produced by Anton Koberger. It had more than 650 illustrations, and people could order the book with hand-colored illustrations, or they could order it in black and white. And the black and white version was a lot less costly because the illustrations had to be hand-colored. So first, the black and white copy would be printed, and then an artist would go in and hand color the illustrations. Sort of a ancient adult coloring book. There were only 26 woodcuts for the entire book that represented 69 different cities. So some of them were just a generic print of a city. They didn't actually represent the city that they stood for. However, this one does. It actually represents the city of Nuremberg. And the hand-colored page represents Tarvism, which is a town in the extreme northeast of Italy. Oh, I'm sorry. This particular, I told you the Nuremberg image represented the city of Nuremberg. It does not. It is an image that represents the city of Tarvisio, which was a town to the extreme northeast of Italy. It has blunt, simple lines and is made in the woodcut technique. It gives a detailed perspective of Tarvisio. Its walls and towers and churches and municipal buildings all exist within the illustration, and there's a baronial castle on the hill. A baronial castle is a fancy word for a castle at which barons are there. Despite the numerous architectural structures, historians can't determine whether this illustration represents the artist's accurate depiction of Tarvisio or a depiction of his fanciful imagination. Artists often reprinted the same image as illustrations of different cities, and this depiction of Tarvisio is a very likely a generic view of Tarvisio, but regardless, the work is a monument to a new craft, the craft of printmaking and the craft of printing the textbook. In fact, in the history of advertising and design, this is one of the very first groundbreaking pieces. Here's a close-up of the Nuremberg Chronicle published by Anton Koberger. Just sit and study it. You'll see all kinds of really interesting things, like the man in the front walking around with the pack on his back, the place in which people hooked their horses up to keep them steady while they gathered water from the well or entered the city.